Let me ask you something. What do the Salem witch trials, the satanic panic of the 1980s, and QAnon all have in common? The answer? Their reactions to things that didn't happen. Witches weren't torturing young girls in colonial Massachusetts, satanic cults weren't building tunnels on their daycares, and Donald Trump isn't the God Emperor of mankind waging a crusade against demonic forces of chaos. But because people believe these things were, or are, happening, it justified terrible acts against innocent victims. And while we like to think we're smart enough to not make the same mistakes, we don't realize how often we've been wrong because history sometimes treats the conspiracy theory as reality. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian. Let's talk about the Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade. The Cathars were a dualist religion mostly located in a region of southern France, sometimes called Toulouse, Languedoc, Provincia, or Occitania, during the 12th to 14th century. Possibly originating from the Balkans or even the ideas of early Gnostic Christians, Cathars believed in two gods, the evil God of the Old Testament who created the imperfect physical world, and the good God of the New Testament who introduced themselves through the spiritual being we know as Jesus. The Cathars organized themselves similar to the Catholic Church, with priests and bishops, but women could also be leaders in the church. They were also vegetarians and abstained from sex and procreation. As you can imagine, the Catholics weren't fans of this new faith, and after a papal representative who was visiting the region was killed, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade in 1209 that promised salvation for Christians who took up the cross and killed these heretics. What followed was a 20-year-long war that saw the Cathar Church destroyed. Later, the Inquisition would be created to not only hunt down the remaining Cathars, with the last known one being executed in 1321, but also persecute Muslims, Jews, and other heretics for generations to come. Also, did you know the Inquisition has a website? I don't know, I just find that fact wild. Now, this is what most people know about the Cathars. Heck, this is what I personally learned going through Catholic school. But it's likely not true. There is a revisionist take on the Cathars that is growing in popularity. Now, to be clear, they aren't saying the Crusade and other later hunts by the Inquisition didn't happen, but the reasons they happened are more complicated than what history records. I was introduced to this idea by Dr. Justin Sledge, who did a video on this controversy for his YouTube channel, Esoterica. But I also found the 2009 book A Most Holy War, The Albigensian Crusade and the Battle for Christendom by Mark Gregory Pegg to be extremely useful in researching this video. Anywho, the revisionist position is that the Cathar Church never existed. Historians point out that there are few primary sources written by the Cathars, and some documents attributed to them are now considered to be forgeries. Indeed, even the word Cathar rarely appears in the primary sources around the time this alleged church existed, and in fact its earliest use was for referring to schismatics who returned to the Catholic Church. Certainly, the people of Toulouse never referred to themselves as Cathars or Albigensians. Even the dualism, the structure of the Cathar Church, and other beliefs and practices of the Cathars didn't begin to enter historical record until after the Albigensian Crusade. The sources for these beliefs included interrogations done by the Inquisition, an organization known for asking leading questions and torturing people if they didn't get the answers they wanted. This should go without saying, but we really shouldn't trust the Inquisition to tell the truth. But something must have been going on in Toulouse to trigger a crusade, right? Those just don't happen for nothing. Well, it's important to remember this was a time when the Catholic Church was becoming a lot less tolerant of other religions and any potential heresy. The Fourth Crusade of 1202 happened only a few years prior to the Albigensian Crusade, which, although originally aimed at Egypt, instead ended with the sacking of the Orthodox Christian city of Constantinople. Additionally, in 1215, nearing the end of the Albigensian Crusade, there was the Fourth Council of the Lateran, a council of Catholic Church leaders that not only standardized certain aspects of the faith, but also codified the persecution of Jews, Muslims, and heretics into church law. And this is also when the Inquisition first appeared on the scene to hunt heretics, and inquisitors were likely trained how to spot them by studying the heretics that came before, like the early Gnostic Christians with their dualist faith. And so when you consider what the Catholic Church was like at the time, it's easy to see how they might confuse unique traditions of a specific region to be outright heresy. You see, at the time, Toulousian society recognized certain people as being holy and called them good men or good women, although for simplicity's sakes, I will still occasionally refer to them as Cathars. Anywho, these Cathars lived a philosophy of restraint and moderation that they based on the life of Jesus. This moderate lifestyle sometimes meant they didn't eat a lot of meat, but there is no strong evidence to suggest they were vegetarians. As for sex and procreation, while technically anyone could become a good man or woman, widows or widowers were more likely to take on the role, while young people would only temporarily become a good man or woman before getting married. This lifestyle made locals willing to accept these Cathars as secular leaders or judges in disputes, even going so far as to greet them in a very specific and formal manner, but they were not organized in any formal church. Good women also didn't necessarily have leadership roles in Toulousian society, but rather lived together similar to nuns but with less of the formality. In this role, they sometimes acted as guardians to young women before they were to be married. Now, to be fair, the good men did sometimes preach and perhaps collectively developed religious beliefs that put more emphasis on the New Testament over the Old, but it would be unfair to say they believed the God of the Old Testament was a separate evil God. Indeed, if you asked the good men and women what religion they were, they'd likely say they were Catholics, and any deviation from church doctrine was probably not any more significant than any other part of Christendom that had their own local traditions, practices, or even folk magic. But unfortunately for the people of Toulouse, they were too close to an increasingly heretic-obsessed Rome and had few friends to come to their defense. You see, early 13th century Toulouse, despite nominally being a part of the Kingdom of France, basically did its own thing. It was culturally unique from northern France, with its own laws, language, and style of dress that made it more similar to their neighbor, the Kingdom of Aragon. To take it one step further, local nobles would sometimes pledge fealty to the King of Aragon, or even the King of England, who at the time of the Albigensian Crusade was King John of the Magna Carta fame. They sometimes even throw their support behind an anti-pope, which probably didn't make them popular in Rome. So perhaps the most plausible explanation for why the Albigensian Crusade happened is that the Catholic Church panicked about the alleged heresy in a maverick province of France, which had its own unique but probably not Gnostic traditions. What happened next was a 20-year war that devastated the entire region and its people. The good men and women were either killed, renounced their alleged heresy, or went into exile. Perhaps some were eventually hunted down by the Inquisition, but it's just as likely these alleged Cathars were innocent people. Meanwhile, Toulouse became much more French, but even today many people in the region of Languedoc embrace their alleged Cathar heritage, not just because it drives in the tourists, but also as a way to thumb their nose at Paris, as Chris O'Brien pointed out in his 2018 article on the Cathars for the Los Angeles Times. So now what? Does this mean I can't have Cathar missionaries riding airships around the world to warn people of the evils of the physical realm? Well, maybe I still can, but first, let's begin the speculation by asking, what if the people of Toulouse defeated the Crusaders? There are some potential points of divergence here. For example, let's say Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, pursues a different strategy in dealing with the Crusaders. In our timeline, Raymond was public enemy number one for the Crusaders for protecting the alleged Cathars in his realm. But when the Crusaders arrived, rather than fight them, Raymond agreed to all of their demands and then took up the cross himself. Presumably, Raymond thought that by joining the crusade he could direct it and thus lessen the damage they would do to his lands. But in hindsight, that was wishful thinking. The Crusaders never trusted Raymond, and so continued to accuse him of heresy, made increasingly humiliating demands of him, and eventually attacked him directly. However, in an alternate timeline, Raymond realizes there is no compromising with the Crusaders, and so he leads the defense of Toulouse against them. Taking advantage of fighting on their home turf, Raymond and his followers use the rugged terrain of the region to effectively harass the Crusaders. Additionally, food stores are emptied and taken into cities and castles to deny them to the invaders. With increasing losses, low supplies, and few opportunities to plunder, because, let's be honest, that's what most of these Crusaders are here for, the crusade loses steam. Or perhaps outside factors indirectly aid the Cathar cause. For example, in our timeline, the King of France was repeatedly asked to lead the crusade, but refused due to threats from England and the Holy Roman Empire. So in our timeline, perhaps some new threat arises that distracts the attention of potential crusaders. Alternatively, the Cathars may get help from an ally. In our timeline, the King of Aragon, Peter II, briefly intervened on the side of the Cathars, but was defeated and killed at the Battle of Muret against a much smaller crusader force. But in an alternate timeline, Aragon's intervention is a tad more successful, or perhaps even the English intervene on the side of the Cathars, as they threatened to do several times in our timeline, since the Crusaders didn't always respect the boundaries of their nearby territory. Thus, one or a combination of these changes means that rather than 20 years of Crusaders running amok in southern France, They are instead beaten back early in support for the crusade withers away. So what happens next? Well, it's hard to accurately predict 800 years of altered history, but in a more optimistic timeline, the people of Toulouse are able to reconcile with the Catholic Church and convince the Pope there was never any heresy. The Church forges a new path in this timeline where they aren't as concerned with heresy and are willing to tolerate local traditions more and perhaps even mass adopt those they approve of. The Inquisition never really develops, witch hunts are exceedingly rare, there is more tolerance for Jews and Muslims living in Christian lands, and perhaps even the Protestant Reformation is avoided. The more pessimistic and perhaps more plausible outcome is that the Church simply excommunicates the people of Toulouse and any allies. Toulouse becomes independent of France, and Catholic clergy leave or are driven out of the region. The good men and women take on more prominent spiritual roles in society, and thus turn their philosophy of moderate living into a formal religion. Good men come to assume titles similar to priest and bishop, with even good women taking on leadership roles in the church. The Cathars soon refine and expand on their beliefs, especially as their new religion spreads into other parts of Europe, like Aragon and Aquitaine. Later, Cathar scholars begin to question whether the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament. Perhaps they are separate gods, and the one the Cathars follow is the good God, while the Catholics follow the evil one. Ironic to think that a dualist Cathar church could only really exist in an alternate history. But what was the point of this particular what if? Well, I wanted to highlight a unique challenge for alternate historians, as in what happens when new evidence is uncovered or new interpretations of existing evidence is published that changes how we remember historical events. Now, I don't think those who created alternate histories using the traditional account of the Cathars did anything wrong. It was the accepted version of events for a long time, even if academia now appears to be heading in a different direction. It's just sometimes our understanding of history changes, and your alternate history can have implausibility thrust upon it. However, to avoid this, I do think alternate historians should be careful to read the current research coming out of academia on any given topic, rather than relying on older and potentially out-of-date works. Because while you could write a fun story about the Cathar Church defeating the Albigensian Crusade, it wouldn't be based on the truth. The truth is the people of Toulouse were Catholics, and yet this didn't stop their church from slaughtering them and destroying their home. Their unique culture was purged, and a fake history was created to justify it all. I don't think alternate historians should continue to propagate this fake history by creating stories based on it, and indeed they should be extra careful not to inadvertently spread other myths, lies, propaganda, and conspiracy theories that may have wormed their way into the historical record. Well, that's all I have to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, click that bell icon, share this video, or support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovic, the Alternate Historian. Bye.